Welcome back to Chess Dog. We are returning after a bit of a hiatus as the chess world has been mourning the loss of Grandmaster Daniel Naroditsky. Our condolences to his family and to all of his friends. It was a tremendous loss for the chess world. I've decided not to do a dedicated video on it because it's just so many other people have done it well, people that knew him. So I will leave that to them. And to be honest, the events of the last couple of weeks have made me long for the golden age of chess, a world of chess before computers, before social media. And that's what we're going to focus on for now on Chess Dog. Our game today is from the U.S. Championships in 1957. The white pieces are being handled by William Lombardy, who was a fixture of New York chess and a grandmaster and a very close friend of Bobby Fischer, who's had an interesting life. He passed away, I think, in 2017. He became a priest. He left the priesthood, and he was just a very interesting figure in the history of chess. He has the white pieces. Bobby Fischer has the black pieces. Let us jump right in. Lombardy begins with d4. Fischer plays knight f6, and we quickly have a King's Indian on the board. And William Lombardy is going to fianchetto his kingside bishop. And in this structure, White wants to take away black's fun in the King's Indian, make it harder to get a kingside attack, and keep the center fluid. Castles, bishop to g2, d6, castles, and knight to c6. And this knight wants to support a quick e5, and d5 is played by Lombardy before that happens, and Fischer plays knight to a5. So if you're not familiar with this line, this may look strange because we all know the old saying, a knight on the rim is dim or grim or it's bad. You don't want your knight on the side of the board, traditionally. And this knight at a5, it isn't good that it's on the side of the board, but the idea is it's putting pressure on c4, which is now not able to be defended from a bishop at f1 because that bishop moved to g2. And there's a big battle here. If black can trade off this knight at some point and put enough pressure on c4 to do that, black's usually doing very well. White wants to make it so that it gets stuck at a5 and can't do anything. But white has to be very careful how he defends c4. If he plays b3 prematurely, the bishop at g7 can snag that rook at a1. So it becomes very tactical. Also, the possibility of b4 trapping the knight is something black has to worry about. So knight f to d2. He defends with the king's knight, which allows this bishop to be a little less blocked, but basically he wants this knight to come to c3. c5, this is the standard idea. And if white takes en passant, Fischer just takes at c6, and the knight at d2 is really misplaced. So a3, threatening b4, which could trap this knight at a5. So b6 from Fischer gives the knight a place to hide, but now b4 is played. And at this point, if Fischer plays, like, say, knight to h5 to reveal an attack on the rook could just move up. So that's not a problem. So the knight goes back to b7 and bishop to b2. And it's fair to say that William Lombardy has won the opening battle here. White's pieces are well placed, and he's doing quite well. And this knight at b7 is the pits. This is a really terrible piece. Fischer's whole queenside development isn't very good here. a5, b5, and that locks up the queenside. So play will now take place either in the center or on the king side, most likely. Fischer plays e5, and he would love for white to ignore that and then maybe move this knight out of the way, play f5, and get some standard kingside attacking play. So Lombardy goes ahead and takes en passant, and that, of course, also opens the bishop, and now this knight is pinned. Fischer, in return, at the very least, does get some flexibility with these central pawns. He can move one or the other depending on the situation. White plays e4. Fischer plays e5. So he shuts off his own bishop on the long diagonal, but he also shuts off white's dark squared bishop on the long diagonal. He creates a strong point for his own knight at d4, but also a strong point for white's knight at d5. The only difference is if Fischer has a knight here and it gets exchanged off and he takes it one way or the other, he would have a protected passed pawn. That wouldn't be true of a knight being captured at d5. Anyway, knight to c3, aims right at that d5 square. Rook to b8. This is not a move I was able to figure out. I don't know why he made that move. It's one thing if this diagonal were open and there was a pin there. Maybe he anticipated in some variation it could be open, but I never could figure out why he played rook to b8 here. A knight to d5, bishop to e6, putting some, maybe he could exchange off the bishop or the knight for the knight at d5. a4, completely locking up that queen side for the time being. Knight to d7. So he wants to move this queen. He doesn't want to take the knight. He wants to move the queen, but he has to defend the b6 pawn. So he moves the knight to d7 to defend b6, and he clears the way for the queen to be developed more accurately. Rook to a3 from white. This is a standard maneuver for white and the king's Indian. The rook can be very strong on the third rank, particularly in a defensive posture. Bishop to h6. Since the main diagonal is blocked, he moves the bishop to a better diagonal, aiming possibly at this knight at d2. And f4. And again, white is just doing well here, gaining more space and putting pressure on black center. Pawn takes, knight takes, aiming at the bishop at e6, so that bishop tucks back at f7. And here, white has a very strong move, modern computers pointed out, and that's the move e5. It's a pawn sack, at least temporary, if not permanent, but it unleashes 3 pieces all at once. It opens that diagonal for the g7 bishop, the b2 bishop, and gives the knight at d2 the e4 square. So that could really have unleashed white's pieces. Rook to d3 also was playable, but instead he plays knight to d5. And now Fischer begins to make his move. He knows that this was not maybe the best move for white, so now he makes his move. He takes the knight with the bishop. And here it looks like ed5 might have been the better move, but Lombardy takes with the c-pawn. It looks like he's wanting to play knight to c4 and take advantage of sort of a blockade of this passed pawn, aiming at d6 and b6. The problem is, if Fischer can challenge that knight successfully, then he'll be left with just a protected passed pawn at c5. Rook to takes f1 check, bishop f1. Now bishop comes back to g7. The bishops get exchanged, knight to c4, but now knight to e5. And Fischer's able to successfully challenge that knight. The knight takes e5, de5, and now it's Fischer that wants to blockade a protected passed pawn, play the knight to d6. In fact, just going ahead and playing d6, sacking that pawn and opening up this diagonal and pressure down the d file might have been white's best. Queen to g4, queen to e7 to try to control the entry squares for white's queen. Rook to d3 with a potential threat to play d6 supported by the rook. Here, c4 was actually a very strong move from black, hitting the rook, and also the queen or knight can enter this c5 square, but he plays the knight to d6, and that hits e4 and supports a c4 push. But now queen to e6, rook to e8. Again, he doesn't want to play queen takes e6. In this position, white seems to be a little bit better. So rook to e8, bishop to h3, just building on that square. He doesn't want to lose that pawn after an exchange. But now queen to c7. And this is essentially a double attack. The rook is attacking the queen, and the knight is attacking the e4 pawn. But also the threat of playing c4 followed by queen to c5 check, where the queen could enter into b4 or d4, is quite a serious threat. And now Fischer has the advantage. He's gotten that advantage back. Queen to d7 check, the queen's come off. Rook to d8 hits the bishop, but again, he's attacking e4. The bishop goes to c6, knight takes e4. Rook to e3 hits the knight as well as the pawn, so the knight goes to d2, and that's a little trick, of course. If white were to take the pawn, then knight to f3 check would fork the king and the rook. That's Fischer's trick here. So the rook first goes to e2 to hit the knight, but now the knight goes to c4, where it defends the e5 pawn. But now rook to e4. hitting the knight and the pawn. So knight to b2. He attacks a4, the base of the pawn chain, king to f2, and here the best move for black, as it turns out, is king to f6, keeping this pawn defended. Then after king to e3, c4, king to d2, knight takes e4, and this was probably the better line for black. But he plays knight to d1 check, and Fischer is going to try to keep him busy with his very active knight. King to e1, now knight to c3, hits the rook and the a4 pawn, but that allows the capture of that pawn, but now knight takes a4. And Fischer has two protected passers on the queen side, but white's going to get an active rook. Rook to e7 check, king to h6, king to d2, c4. The knight controls the square in front of the pawn, so all three of these squares are off limits to the white king at the moment. Rook to e4 attacks the pawn. Now knight to c5. Rook to c4 looks okay, but he plays rook to e7 and says, I'll let my king deal with this passed pawn. So Fischer plays the knight back to a4 to control the pawn and the square in front of that pawn. Now here, Lombardy misses an idea, as it turns out. He plays h4. The best move, it looks like, was rook to f7, and the idea is that he wants to keep Fischer from activating this rook. And with the rook on f7, the f8 and e8 squares are controlled, and the rook cannot get active. When he plays h4, now Fischer can play rook to f8, and now that rook can become active. Here, Lombardy obviously calculated deeply. He calculated that after d6, there would be a race between his passed pawn and Fischer's passed pawn, and he felt good, I guess, about the outcome. Turns out this brilliant move was the better move for white, and that's the move g4. And here's the reason. Now when the race starts, just like in the main line, this bishop to d7 move creates all sorts of nasty threats, and after c2, g5 would lead to mate, because this bishop controls g5. This is a mating position. So without that, Fischer's going to win this race. So d6 from Lombardi, c3 check, king c2, rook f2 check, king to b3. Now watch this. He plays rook to b2 check. He doesn't advance the pawn. He's sacrificing the knight, but he's calculated this very closely, Fischer has. So king takes knight, c2, obviously he's one move away from queening his pawn, rook to e1 pretty much forced. And now watch this move from Fischer. He doesn't immediately try to queen the pawn. He plays rook to b4 check first. And the reason, he wants to put the king on a3, so now in certain lines, when he queens, it'll be with check, and it will rob white of a key tempo. A really smart, very sharp move from Fischer. Rook to b1, bishop to e4, but now simply rook takes, bishop takes, and white has the passed pawn, but just rook to e6, attacks it, forces it forward, and rook to d6, and he's going to win this pawn, and the bishop can't go to f5 because the pawn controls it. And that was it, and Lombardi resigned in this game, and of course, as you know, they would go on to become very good friends and rivals. And but this back and forth affair with a lot of brilliant ideas was their first meeting in a United States championship. Hope you've enjoyed this game. See you again soon at Chess Talk. Goodbye.